Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you all for coming out to our Storyteller series this evening. We have a really good. We're going to be having a really good discussion today about keeping our communities safe and the history of violence that APD has had within throughout the history here in Albuquerque. And so to start things off today, I'm going to give it up to our one of our longtime organizers, Joaquin Lujan, who's going to give us a bit of an introduction.
Testing.
Hello. Is that working?
Well, thank you, Buenas tardes, for joining us today. We've been, this is our third storytelling session that we're having here at the Peace and Justice, where we've been sort of discussing a whole lot of different things. We've talked about our local farmers, we've talked about a whole lot of different things within folks that have worked for a whole lot of years here in Albuquerque and through New Mexico. And so, being that there's a whole lot of action happening right around Albuquerque now, police brutality, people are getting beat up, there's a whole lot of fear out there. We were asked to maybe do our storytelling about what we've done with that issue here, throughout the last 40 years, and what our history has been with police brutality. And so for me, I was 17 years old. I'm from the North Valley, Los Duranes, and so there was a whole lot of people, bunch of people being beat up in 68, 69, 1970. A lot of things that were going down after the Poor People's Campaign in 68. But what I've been noticing in what was happening then and looking at what's happening now is folks that were being beat up were people of my culture and indigenous folks, the Chicano folks, and a lot of that beating was kept up in the barrios in the North and the South Valley. So that's what was happening then in 68, 69.
Bueno,
Do I have to
start over.
New Mexico, we have a lot of history of
Taking on these kinds of issues. I mean, from our land being stolen to the intense racism here in the earlier days. A lot of the folks in the prisons were folks of color, and when you look back then, the reasons that they were landing in jail were really poor reasons, poor excuses. But anyways, we were faced with a whole lot of police brutality, throughout Albuquerque and throughout the barrios. And so out of that, there was a young organization, which I am very proud to have been a part of, that got together to not only to deal with police brutality, but to deal with a whole lot of Chicano issues, and that was the Black Gray Organization. And so we were all young, and we identified with the community that was being beat up. So for us, it was very clear who was being beat up, who was being killed. They were killing us back in those days also. And it was in the barrios. Heavy drugs, heroin, all of that was contained and kept. It wasn't until Albuquerque started getting bigger and folks with money started getting interested in the valley did things change. But we wanted to talk a little bit about our history just because maybe somehow or another it can help some of the things that we're faced today. One of the things we did was to start the community patrol, where we actually went out and we stopped. And back in those days, the technology was very, I think we had a little broken radio band that told us where they were stopped and they were holding somebody. So we would go, strictly stay legal, but we would observe. And the pressure was put on us, on our organization, and that's what we were offering to the community. So again, one of the things that hopefully people understand is that you have to be a part of the community.
who are you confronting on behalf of. And so if you understand your communities, it makes it easier to deal with the situation. I can go on, and I'll say some more stuff, but really I want to introduce one of the old-time leaders of the Blackberry organization. He was our voice piece. He was, pretty intense back in those days, pretty intense today. But he'll be talking a little bit more about the beret history as we move forward.
We're going to let everybody introduce themselves.
Oh, introduce first?
Yes.
Okay. Bueno. So which way do you want to go?
So, just to set the context for this, I guess, the way that we're going to start this off is everybody on the panel, if you guys can say your name, and then how are you a part of helping the community, how have you been a part of this issue or worked on this issue in the past? So I'm going to model that. My name's Emma. I'm the organizer of the Southwest Organizing Project, and I have worked on stuff around school to prison pipeline, criminalization of young people, etc. So maybe we could start at the end. Fernando, do you want to go first?
Sure.
And then we'll go this way.
My name is Fernando Aveta. I was a community organizer with the Southwest Organizing Project from about, 97 to about 2003, working on these kinds of issues, mostly around youth organizing and criminalization of young people, really starting to get into discussing what that term meant, criminalization of young people, and more specifically young people of color, here in the Southwest as a whole, Albuquerque primarily, my involvement in the Southwest program.
Good evening, my name is Richard Moore. What brings me here actually tonight, and some of the things that we've been involved in, I'll talk a little bit more about that when we do the introductions. But this year, this will be the 50th anniversary of my involvement, our involvement in terms of community issues here. So we're celebrating that. It's an honor to be here this evening in you all's presence to share some of that with you. So I'm just going to pass it on, and I'll say a few words about the Black Berets and others as we open up the discussion.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everybody. My name is Antonio Maestas. I'm a lawyer here in town. I also represent the West Mesa in the State House. But the reason I'm here is two reasons. One, I practice criminal defense, mostly misdemeanors. I've been going to Metro Court pretty much every day for 15 years, talking to cops. I was a prosecutor for a while, and then now obviously defense attorney, but I've seen a difference over time, significant difference. And I still stay in touch with former police officers, and I have breakfast with a former commander on the down low, and we talk about how APD has just, changed. It's always had its problems, but the problems today are since like 06, 07, when they started training the cops differently. Any cop who came in after 06 is just different than the cops that came in before 06. But today I'll be talking about another struggle that's similar, which is the Duran Consent Decree, which is the prisoners' rights struggle that extended from like the late 70s to the late 90s. So we'll get into that later. Thank you. Very, very honored to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lucille. How's the mic working? Okay. So my name is Lucille Cordova, and I have been a member and volunteer with SWOP for about 10 years. The reason I'm here is because I had a son in prison, and he was at the Main a couple years before it closed. And so I wanted to briefly tell you about that experience. And I also started an organization. It was called Philo, Families of Incarcerated Loved Ones. And I'll tell you a little bit about that experience as well, and our interaction with the Department of Corrections, and specifically, namely, and I'm going to start in on his case, Rob Perry. So that's why I'm here.
Joaquin Lujan, SWOP organizer.
Hi everybody, I'm David Correa. I'm a professor at UNM in American Studies, and I write about law and property and violence, and wrote a book about the Tierra Maria land grant that included years of struggle against the police in Rio Grande County, with La Jicarita. If you've never heard of it, it's a community newspaper online, and we've been covering this, and over the past month, really every day, we're updating these stories. So we've been covering this, and we continue to cover this, and I'm here to talk about, Rodrigo asked me to talk about, you know, what's happening now in relation to the struggles in the past. I think that what I want to talk about is what can be different in terms of confronting this intractable and ruthless pattern of police violence today, and what we need to do about that. And that would be my contribution. Thanks.
So we're having technical difficulties. You know, equipment doesn't work right and stuff, that happens. But so I'm going to kick it back to Richard, so he can talk a little bit more about some of the stuff Joaquin started talking about. I'm trying to figure out this mic situation because I would like it to be a conversation that we can all have, share the mics, pass them back and forth. Is that would work? Yeah. So I'm just going to ask Richard to talk a little bit more, expand on some of the stuff Joaquin mentioned in terms of community patrols and some of the pushback. And if you could just kind of give us a picture of what the political climate was at that point, especially leading into the riots in 1971, and kind of if you guys could give us that story of the beret involvement in that. So, Richard.
If y'all don't mind, I'm gonna stand up a little bit. It's a lot more easier for me to get excited when I'm standing up than it is when I'm sitting down. Again, I just wanted to say that it's great to be here this evening with everyone, both old friends and new friends to be. We started off as young organizers here in Albuquerque in the 1960s. Joaquin kind of touched on it a little bit, just to bring us up on some of the police issues. In actuality, in the late 1960s here on the campus, and actually in the community, there was a student community coalition that was formed here. And some may remember the strike that took place here on the campus of the University of New Mexico, where the students, the workers, and the community came together with some of the faculty and so others to close this university down. I'm not going to actually talk about that. I just have to put that in its proper place, because many of us that have been engaged in these issues for a while have a long history of both student organizing, community organizing, and other kinds of organizing that has taken place in this city, including the war in Vietnam and so on. I think we need to, as we kind of open up the discussion around criminal justice and particularly the police department, just put a couple of things in its proper perspective. I think for us and Joaquin and many other sisters and brothers, we remember the killing of Tommy Valles. Tommy was killed in the Old Town area, and in the late 60s. And there was a whole series. That's why when we see what's happening today, we see it not just as a recent trend within the struggles or the militarization of the police departments. This has a long history to go along with it. Also, just moving along pretty quickly, it wasn't only happening in Albuquerque, it was happening all over the state of New Mexico. And some of you may remember the killing or the assassination of Linda Montoya in Santa Fe at Tonantzin School that was shot by the Santa Fe Police Department. And we could go on and on. In Taos, New Mexico, there was a killing by the Taos Police Department and a series of beatings and other activities on the part of the Taos Police Department. In Española, New Mexico, the brutality and the beating that took place, that a lot of our sisters and brothers encountered during that time. Southern New Mexico, in Las Cruces, in Anthony, in some of the smaller communities, even in the South, and so on. So I just say that very quickly, just to say that police repression and police killings and police buildings and beatings and racial profiling is not anything that's not new to our community. I just want to just take that just a little step further and then remind people of Gallup, New Mexico, when Larry Casus was killed. Larry was a brother that was actually the president of the Kiva Club, which was a student organization here on campus. And then Bob and that whole situation that came down in Gallup with the Gallup Police Department and so on. So we could keep on going. Ricardo Falcon in Rio Grande, New Mexico, a young Chicano on the way to El Paso at the Rasanita Convention that was killed by a gas station owner in Rio Grande, New Mexico, only because they took that vehicle there and so on, because the car was overheating and this kind of thing, and that they asked the owner of that gas station if they could put water in the car, and that owner told them very quickly, we don't allow Mexicans to use water on our property, and so on. So we could go on and on. We can't separate many of these killings and many cases assassinations. The death of Bobby Garcia, who was a young student organizer here. For any of you that go to the state fair and you go into the Spanish village or the Native American village or the African American village, for those of you that don't know, those protests that took place in front of the state fairgrounds, protesting discrimination, racism, and so on the part of the city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico. So again, sisters and brothers, I mean, we could go on and on and on and on in terms of these, not accidents, because an accident is something you can prevent, incidents that have been taking place, not only on the part of the Albuquerque Police Department, but the Sheriff's Department and the New Mexico State Police. Now we see this recent kind of thing that's happening with the U.S. Marshals and so on. No? And I just want to move us quickly because we have other sisters and brothers here that we want to make sure has the opportunity to speak. Some of you know that 5 members of the Black Gray organization were killed very mysteriously. 2 of those, Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova, were killed, not only killed, but assassinated. And we use the word assassination because we don't take lightly the killing of our people, our members, or anyone else in our community. But very clearly, they were assassinated by the Albuquerque Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, and the New Mexico State Police on January 29th of 1972. I was speaking with some sisters and brothers today as we were driving down Coors and going into the Black Mesa area and just kind of reflecting on the assassination of our members, Juan Baca, Ramona Griego, and on, as I say, with not only our members, but others, African Americans, Latinos, Chicanos, Mexicanos, poor white folk that also, in some cases, that lived and worked in the South Broadway area. So, and Native Americans as we see it. So at that particular point, and that moment in history, they had the free reign, and both the moral and political authority was given to them by this city, by the state of New Mexico, and in many cases, the federal government. And we need to hold all of them responsible, not only for what happened then, for what's taking place right now in this city and so on. So I just want to just say this as we pass this on. These recent developments as we see them right now, the ongoing continuation, the assassination, the murdering, the brutality that's taking place in this city right now is nothing else, and we all know it in this room, but criminal, and many of those elected officials, and I'm not talking about elected officials that we know that are friends of ours, but I'm very specifically talking about the mayor of this city, Barry, Perry, and the whole crew. Perry has never been a friend of ours, will never be a friend of us, and you all know that at one point in his life, he also was head of the criminal justice system for the state of New Mexico. And so he was also responsible in those positions for the beatings and so on in the state penitentiary, not only in Santa Fe, but other penal institutions throughout this country. He needs to be locked up, put in jail, and some of our sisters and brothers that are in that institution now for small crimes and whatever need to be released out of there so that they can be put back in the hands of the community. And for their crimes, then the community should be the one that's dealing with people that commit crimes against the community. We can say with Barry, and Barry can say whatever he wants. And if you see Perry very recently, he looked real beat up on TV on that press conference that he had, stumbling and mumbling over words and so on. It was an honor to see his mumbling and stumbling and the way he looked on that TV program, as ridiculous as that he looked. That boy's been lying consistently, and he's one of the criminals in this city. And we need to be very, very clear about that. Now, we've got recommendations, and I want to just open this up for that discussion. We've got recommendations. I've got recommendations. I'm sure that others here do have. But what I do want to say, sisters and brothers, at the end of the day, at this particular moment, in terms of what's happening here, yes, the chief of police needs to be replaced. The one that resigned, and we know quit under pressure, that went to work for the Taser company, and helped to sign that $5 million contract for the Albuquerque Police Department while he was there. This recent one, or whoever they may be. So I say that to you, so that we can ground ourselves as we understand understand the militarization of police departments and so on, is that we need real structural change in this city right now. We can replace some of those folks, and they need to be replaced, including the mayor and all the rest of them. But we need some deep-rooted structural change here, because as long as they're given the moral and political authority to kill, beat, and brutalize, they're going to continue to do that. So I just want to leave it there, pass this microphone on, and then we also wanted to, we will engage in the discussion here as we open it up to our sisters and brothers, and at the same time, we have some suggestions or recommendations in terms of how to move forward. Thank you very much, sisters and brothers, for listening.
Thank you, Rich. Richard always brings such an amazing perspective, and he's been doing this for so long. So I just really wanted to open it up and have Joaquin talk a little bit as well. Specifically, I'm interested in hearing more perspective from you both about the Roosevelt riot and what the kind of community conditions were that led to that riot. I know you guys were there. I've heard the stories from you, so now I want you to tell the people.
Wow. Relive the riots. That's gonna be fun. Well, it was the summertime. I'm thinking it was June, Rich, when those riots happened. Up at Roosevelt Park. Okay, where's Roosevelt Park from here? Back down, back up this way. We had already been in our organization, the Black Berets. We had already developed the community patrol. We had already been out in the barrios. So we had a feel for what was going on. We were working with the community. The community was coming out with, to tell us their story, to tell us what was happening, how they got beat up, how the cops went into their homes and started abusing the whole family, kind of a thing. So that really got us going. And as we're working on these kinds of issues, comes around this June afternoon. It's probably a Sunday. In fact, it was Richard's birthday. On that day, we had a little office in Barelas, the Black Beret office in Barelas, and we get a phone call from somebody, says, you better come down to Roosevelt Park, it's getting heavy. The police are instigating and really getting the young folk all going crazy over there, and so you should go down there. So Rich and I and some of the other berets, we headed up there, and when we got there, the youngsters had just finished tossing over a couple of police cars. They just flipped them over, and so the intensity is starting, and the police moved away from there and went up on the hill where the education department was, and they all gathered up there. So from the park to this hill is really just this long stretch. And so Richard and I and a couple other berets said, well, let's go up there and talk to the police and see if we can't calm things down before they really get crazy. So the police wait till we're halfway up that hill, and they started open fire on us. And I've never run so fast in my life, diving over to the trees, and all shit broke out. They started shooting. They only antagonized the crowd, so the kids started putting Molotovs together, and folks were being shot. We got one brother that we had to drag out of the middle of that war, put him on top of a car, and have him pull out of there to be able to go to the hospital. So it just went crazy. And so, and I'll put Rich under, what we thought to do at that particular point is, especially after they opened fire on us, so we gathered everybody in the park and said, let's march down Central and down to the police station, and let's take this thing to the front door. And so we did. But back in those days, there's all kinds of things that are happening, like folks were together up here heading into downtown, but by the time we got there, a lot, I don't know if half the youth, a lot of the youth were running crazy. Well, we had those infiltrators, that played a role, and they were involved, and they were passing out, I think back in those days was Reds, or I don't know what the hell it was. And so, this is how the thing was going, but the riot was pretty intense, and in fact, the police in the police building couldn't get out,
and those that were out couldn't get in, so they were going up on the roof, and we're getting ready to open up, and so our organization put itself between the community and the police, and so that was our job, we felt. But those are the basics that started happening, that we had to go after that little underground because they were looking for us big time. They bring in the National Guard comes in, and so it's very interesting when we talk about community and about what people think you're doing on behalf of the community, because we started getting calls at our office from National Guards folk that were being called in and saying, we're not going. We are not going to go and shoot our own people. We are just not doing it. This is in 71. So there was just a whole lot of things going on, and again, it all, you know, from police brutality. I mean, we were trying and telling folks, they were advertising for police in Oklahoma City. And rather than getting police that were part of the community, maybe they don't shoot you so quickly. You know, if they've gone to church with you or something. But no, you get these brutes coming in from Oklahoma City who, you know, are spinning the guns around, and so they got pretty out of hand. And so that was at least that start, that piece, and some other things we were doing. We, of course, declared that we would protect ourselves, and we were armed. Legally, you know, maybe a couple of bullets, but we were armed. And we're saying, you know, you're not going to take us down this way. You know, it's already just too much of what you've done, and so if that's not happening. That was us. I had hair, and we were young, and we were just thinking on these things. Rich, you might probably want to add something to that.
I just want to take my hat off. I do have
He
Joaquin and I go way back. I mean, we're really honored to do it. My brother, and as you know, our families were very, very tight throughout this period. I just want to just ground us a little bit just on what Joaquin was talking about, and just take a quick look at what the city looked like during that time that my brother's speaking about those issues. There was a lot of activity in the city in the 60s and the 70s, and I think you all, again, some of you know of that history. The land grant movement was extremely active. The whole issue of water and and water rights and this kind of thing, health care, child care, student issues, school issues in schools, in junior high schools. It was junior high schools then, now it's mid schools, high schools. There was a lot of celebration, a lot of culture of being proud of yourself and being proud of your community and being proud of where you come from and so on. And so there was a lot of community activity and activism taking place. Roosevelt Park was a place that we all hung out at. It was one of those places. We used to hang out by the ditches in the acequias and also in different parks and so on. But Roosevelt Park was a place that you went on Saturday or Sunday and you'd find hundreds upon hundreds of people and their families with their children playing volleyball and barbecues and this kind of thing. In many cases, the things you don't see, things that this day we take for granted because of the kind of controls that they put over our lives and so on. But that's kind of really the way it was. As young people, many of our members came from many of these communities that we're talking about, San Jose and South Broadway, Old Town, Los Parillas, the North and South Valley, and so on. And our membership was made up of them. There was many of CYAs that we call them, Chicano Youth Associations, that were also in the elementary schools, the mid schools, it would be mid school now, or in the high schools. UMAS was very active on campus, United Mexican American Students. We were protesting tuition and other kind of things on this campus. So we need to understand when we go this way there, that there also was a different kind of young person that was there. And what I mean by that is that many of those sisters and brothers came from many of the communities. So you talk about police brutality, somebody knew something about it. You talk about incarceration, somebody knew something about it. You talked about food stamps or the lack of health care or whatever you talked about. Somebody knew something about it because our families were being impacted by many of those issues. And probably everyone at that point had someone that was harassed or beaten, or in some cases killed by police agencies and so on. So we decided, as Joaquin said, that we weren't putting up with it anymore. And it wasn't just us, it wasn't the Black Berets. Those community members that we met with consistently in this city, and we decided to do several things. And Joaquin identified one of them. We set up the Black Beret Community Patrol. And in the beginning of the Community Patrol, and those that remember that, we were armed. I want to be very clear about that. But we were armed with cameras, and we were armed with tape recorders and so on. And we would go in, and we knew what the law was. No? We studied the law. We had legal first aid classes, is what we used to call them, and so on. No? So not only for our members, but for our communities. We talked about it and trained and shared what our rights were when it came to the police and so on. And so based upon that, then, as I said, and then we opened up the Black Beret Community Patrol. And then we patrolled the communities ourselves. We stood legally at 25 foot away. We knew the law. We weren't going to get arrested for interfering with an arrest or whatever. So we stood back as far as we could. We taped if it needed to be. We took photos if it needed to be, and so on. And many of those photos, just to remind you, were taken to the Attorney General of the state of New Mexico in terms of some of the issues of brutality that was being talked about. So then later, as Joaquin said, we said as the Minutemen came into Albuquerque and began to assassinate our members and so on. And I say that to you because that particular organization also had members inside the Sheriff's Department, the State Police Department, and the Albuquerque Police Department. And if you think back in history, when it comes to the history of New Mexico, this city or whatever, the leader of the Minutemen organization was arrested and busted in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. And when they dug around his house during that time, they found boxes and boxes of bullets and other kind of things that were found buried on his property. And so the Minutemen during that time claimed, they were happy, they claimed, they announced that they were responsible for the killing and brutality of many of people, not only in our organizations and others. That history is very, very important to us, and it's something that we can and will never forget for the rest of our lives. So yes, we armed ourselves. We had a press conference. We never did anything in the Black Berets without informing and discussing those issues in the community. The community knew exactly what the Black Berets were up to all the time, because the Black Berets were made up and supported of community people throughout this city and so on. So we had a press conference and we announced that we were arming ourselves for self-protection and the self-defense of not only ourselves and our members, but for our community. And so not one shot was fired any time that the Black Berets had armed themselves. We were armed legally. Those particular weapons were not loaded. We knew the law. We set the clips on the car seats. Those rifles that were in our vehicles on rifle racks, they were not loaded. They were unloaded. So we studied the law. We knew the law. We knew what our rights were. But I just say that to you so that we're very clear about the history, our history, or the history of what we're speaking about. Not one shot was fired by one Black Beret organization the whole time that the Black Berets were going through this process. And I will say that to you, as that our sisters and brothers, as they speak for themselves and so on, very clearly will say in many cases that not only did we save their lives, but we saved the brutality and some of the other situations and incidents that were happening in communities here. So I just say that, yes, very clearly as we move along, yes, we attempted, and Mo and others know this, to make a citizen's arrest on the warden at the state penitentiary. Right. What we got to say is that, and I'm making that connection to what we're speaking about right now, and Mo's going to follow up on some of the others on these issues. Because we went through the issues. Our sisters and brothers were being found hung in the state penitentiary. They were brutalized. Rito Canales, our organization, was stabbed in the state penitentiary. So we always took information consistently. I just say this last thing to pass this mic on. We infiltrated the Minutemen organization in this city, and they will never forget that for the rest of their lives. Because based upon that documentation, when they were meeting at Doc Holliday's pawn shop, right over downtown, and many of us remember this story, because that's where they were having their meetings at. And many of those weapons that were being used, and let's just think about that recent weapon and see how that goes. Many of the weapons that were being used to kill our people and so on were stolen weapons, and they were stolen by members of the Albuquerque Police Department, and the Minutemen organization was armed by the law authorities in this city. So yes, very, very clearly then, we moved to make a citizen's arrest as the warden of the state penitentiary was speaking at a hotel. We knew when we went there that we were going to be arrested. We went there to stand up and to speak for ourselves and our sisters and brothers that could not speak for themselves inside this institution. And so that's where we are in terms of some of our history. That's in some respects where we are today. And so if it needs to be, then we're very proud of our history and so on and what took place during that period of time. Our members were arrested for attempting to make a citizen's arrest. We called on the Sheriff's Department and the Albuquerque Police Department and the state police to join us in the arrest. We were making a citizen's arrest for assault and battery, for the assault on civil rights of our sisters and brothers, and assault with intent to kill. And we were taking that warden to our jail in the South Valley of Albuquerque, and he would have truly received the kind of justice that many of us do not receive in these judicial systems. We were going to do that, we were arrested and so on. So I don't want to go on because you know I will, and I can get very excited very easily. And I just say as we pass the mic, yes, when we think about these situations, when we think about them in the 60s, whether we think about them in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or wherever we are today, what we need to do, sisters and brothers, at the end of the day, is do some similar things that took place then. History will only speak for itself. If we don't take that authority, both the moral and political authority with, there's some good offers in those police forces. We knew them then and we know them now. And any honest cop in this city will know that they formed the Chicago Police Officers Association because the Black Gray organization stood up for those good police during that time. They did not call themselves the Hispanic Police Officers Association. They named themselves the Chicano Police Officers Association. So, you know I'll get going. I know it's hard to, but I do know.
Well, thank you, Richard. Like I said earlier, Richard and Joaquin are just so much full of our history and have experienced so much and done so much amazing work. They're both people I really look up to. But thank you, Richard, also for drawing that intentional connection of the citizen's arrest warrant that was served on the warden of the state penitentiary. I think it's really important that we think in terms of not just APD, and even in the current struggle, you know, there was the cavity searches that happened in southern New Mexico. There was a van full of kids in northern New Mexico that were fired upon. It's an issue that affects all of our communities all across the state in various ways. And one of those communities that we really wanted to highlight in terms of talking about state violence and state oppression and the way that oppressive systems work is really focus in on the Duran consent decree. And we're lucky enough to have Representative Maestas here with us, who's, like he said, he's an attorney and he's got a great perspective on some of the kind of criminal justice issues, as well as Lucille Cordova, who, like she said, has a background in working with prisoners and prisoners' rights and family advocacy stuff. So we just really want to kind of turn it over to them to talk a little bit about the Duran consent decree and kind of what Richard and Joaquin are talking about. Talked about the political climate that led us into, you know, the riot, really, and kind of the outcomes of the consent decree and how that process worked for the community, and in some cases didn't work for the community. So, Mo.
Thank you very much. My name is Mo Maestas. I am very familiar with the Duran consent decree because Dwight Duran was my uncle. Lived with me off and on throughout my entire childhood. Dwight grew up in Vegas. Many of you guys knew him back in the day. He passed away in 2010. But just a quick history. We all know this, but it's always good to refresh our memories. There was one penitentiary in the 70s. The Department of Corrections was essentially one facility, the Old Main in Santa Fe. And it was like an old telephone pole, just a long hall, and then hallways perpendicular to it. And it was the design back then. It was supposed to hold about 800, 850 inmates. On the night of the riot, there was over 1,300 inmates, about 1,309 inmates. My tío, Dwight Duran, was incarcerated in the mid-70s, and he was an organizer. He was and he had a lot of respect within the prison walls. He could handle himself, and he could get along with the other racial groups in the state pen. And he was about building unity. He saw the injustice. He saw the corruption. He saw the sides of beef going in the pen one way, and in somebody's truck, to their house, another way. He saw the way the power structure within the penitentiary, driven by the warden, would manipulate inmates for information. And if you didn't cooperate, they'd put you in a cell block where they put the protective custody, the snitches. And whether you were a snitch or not, they'd put you in there. And the threat of being a snitch is just a horrible thing. So anyway, they just manipulated everybody. My tío filed a lawsuit. Duran versus King, Duran versus the state of New Mexico. He filed a lawsuit in federal court in 1977. They put him in the hole. Dwight, you gonna drop your lawsuit? No, okay, stay in the hole. I mean, it was some hardcore stuff, hardcore. We think about the sacrifices we make for the movement. I mean, he was literally in the belly of the beast, fighting that injustice. ACLU lawyers jumped in 1978. Great lawyers back in the day. They took it to the next level, and the state made a few concessions. Governor King was listening a little bit. The Secretary of Corrections resigned. I mean, there was a shakeup going on, and Dwight was saying, give it time, give it time. He was trying to keep the lid on it. You had literally, it was divided racially, Black Guerrilla Family, Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Chicanos, and he said, we're making concessions on food, on medical services, on one bump per cell type stuff. He got paroled in December of '79. He frankly wanted to stay in because he knew that the stuff was going to blow. So he came to live with my mom and I, my brother, and you guys know the rest. February 2nd, I got a call. I'm like, yeah, who's this guy? I need to speak to Dwight Duran. I'm like, well, who's this? Well, it's Governor King. I'm like, yeah, right, whatever. Hey, Dwight, Uncle Man. I called him Uncle Man because he was the man, right? So I was like, Uncle Man, some dude wants to talk to you. He's bullshitting. He says he's the governor. My Uncle Dwight went to Santa Fe, went inside the walls of the penitentiary that was unsecured at that time. His life, could have been in danger. He helped negotiate the release of the hostages. No guards were killed. No guards were killed. And as you know, 34 inmates were killed, mostly in the snitch pod, whether they were snitches or not. So it was just pandemonium, mayhem. It was a living hell. They got into the pharmacy. They didn't have knives or guns, so the murders were just horribly brutal, blunt force instruments. One guy got killed by a blowtorch over time to his face. I mean, it was just horrible. So anyway, the Duran versus State of New Mexico was correct. The state did not respond to the petitions of the prisoners. Federal government got involved. They signed a consent decree, the Duran consent decree, so that the Department of Corrections was essentially overseen by a federal magistrate judge. And the consent decree lived on and was finally dismissed in the late 90s. And the state of New Mexico, depending on who the attorney general was or the governor, fought it tooth and nail. They fought medical services for inmates. They fought single cell housing for inmates to cut down on violence and sexual assault. They fought, access to families, visitation, all the rights that prisoners have now. The state of New Mexico was on the wrong side of history. The Duran lawyers finally won, but there's still a long ways to go. Right now, Department of Corrections has more people in solitary in this state than any other state, except for maybe Louisiana. They have what's called in-house parole, where you've done your time, but they don't let you out because the parole plan hasn't been adopted or bureaucratic indifference or whatever. What I want to do in Santa Fe ultimately is eliminate parole, because the Department of Corrections, there's no due process, there's no checks and balances. They make their own rules. Eliminate parole altogether and give the probation department to the judiciary. In the majority of states in this country, the probation department is under the judiciary. But right now, probation and parole is under the Department of Corrections, under the executive branch, which is not right. So we'll get back to the riot and how that affected our families. But in closing, the mayor is surrounded by Rob Perry, who's a cop. The guy was a prosecutor his whole life. He was the Secretary of Corrections. We know that if you're a prosecutor your whole life, do we know anybody like that? That you see the world through an incredibly narrow lens. You don't have your brain doesn't expand very much. And so the former chief, Ray Schultz, surrounded himself with yes men. Chief Schultz may have been a nice guy. Personally, he was a political animal. All the commanders are yes men to Ray Schultz. Then you put in a cowboy, Darren White, just made it even worse. And then you have a mayor who's listening to all these cops telling him it's okay. It was a good shoot. It was just. The majority, not 5, not 10, not a majority of the shootings were unconstitutional.
And frankly, some of those were criminal. And there's been no indictments, no one's been held accountable criminally, but and it's because we have a weak mayor that didn't get a second opinion. That's unfortunate. That's just my 2 cents on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo. Mo's an amazing resource, one of the community leaders that we've been lucky enough to get into elected official position, who can help us kind of think through these things and add a good perspective as, like you said, as a criminal defense lawyer, as an elected official, as someone who's grew up in a movement about protecting communities and protecting our families from state violence. So I would also like to ask Lucille to add some perspective as a mother who has experienced it from that side of the families. What were some of the wins of the Duran consent decree, and then your son was in when the consent decree was actually tossed out. So they started rolling back some of those progressive wins. So just a little bit about your experience and how that kind of affected your family.
My son was in for the last 2 years of the Duran consent decree, and then he was moved. They were all moved out of the main facility. When he was in, it was all right. You know, they could get mail. They had okay food. I wouldn't say great food. I wasn't there, but he tells me it was fine. They had educational programs. They had training. They even had SWOP. So they had a lot of good things going. They kept the crowding down to a bare minimum. He was okay. That's not to say that every time I went to visit, I myself did not, I felt intimidated. I could just sense this thing that they were trying to intimidate the families as well as the prisoners, so that you knew your place, you kept your place, and you were very well aware that if you stepped out of line, that your loved one was going to pay. As the consent decree was vacated, I asked him about it, and he said the first things they did, their main first thing they did, was to remove the Coke machines. I don't know, go figure. That's the mentality. So then things started happening. The families were searched. It wasn't always a strip search by any means, but the controls of who came and went as far as visitors changed. It got pretty drastic. They had this little machine that they just loved, and you had to scan your hand. I can't remember what the process was. And if you passed, great, and if you didn't, you'd made the trip to Santa Fe for nothing. And you know, we had families coming from all parts of the state as well as from out of state. And then I was talking to my son about it, and he said, well, the reason they finally did away with this is because one of our legislators went to visit a family member, and he had to get scanned, and he got mad. And so they took the machine.
An unnamed representative, by the way.
Unnamed, I didn't say who. Actually, I don't think I was even told who. But anyway, so things like that, step by step by step, their privileges were taken. They didn't have a lot of the recreational things that they had before. If anything broke in the weight rooms or whatever, they were not replaced. Their educational programs became almost non-existent. And then they developed a system of, like a 4-step system, I can't really remember, where you earned different kinds of benefits and rewards. But no matter where he was, and he eventually wound up on the honor farm, and it was all right, you know, it wasn't half bad, well, for me anyway. But I always remember that sense of fear and that intimidation and the worry, the constant worry, and the praying. I prayed like a nun, let me tell you. And so that was our perspective as a family. But when we started Philo, our organization, so I gave them my name. They put it in the Albuquerque Journal. It was listed, you know, you get that full page insert that lists all the nonprofit organizations, and the people started calling. and calling. I would get calls all hours of the day and night. And we only started it as a support system because I wanted to visit with and reach out to other people who were experiencing what I was experiencing. And it quickly turned into something else, thanks to Mr. Perry. There was a riot at the Santa Rosa prison, and sure, let's take some measures, let's do something. So he decided that the 100 prisoners that they wanted to remove should be immediately transferred to Texas and West Virginia. And no notice to the prisoners, no, what was the term you were using? No due process, thank you. None of that. They were just said, hey, you're going, you'll be out of here in 3 days. So the families were upset, they were freaked out, and so we had a series of meetings, and we tried to figure out what they could do. I was not involved, my family was not involved in that move. But one of the things I do remember, which is why I'm camera shy, so one of the TV stations came in, in fact a couple, to our meeting. We expected, a handful of family members, and we had like 100 people. There was standing room only. And so the camera guys were doing like full body scans of all these family members. And if the men were there and they had tattoos or any significant body things, they were really scanning these people and really taking their photos. And I realized they're banking photos and information, and for who and why. So we questioned them on it, and they got mad and left. And well, yeah, we kind of stepped on our own foot there, because then we were trying to get public media help, but they were also trying to see who was complaining and get some good information on the family members. We tried to appeal, went through the process to appeal to the warden, the administrative level, and of course ultimately tried to reach out to Perry, and he never responded. He would have people respond and say, well, we'll get back to you. Well, don't worry, it's just for a little while. It's a good facility we're sending them to. And so they patronized us, basically. And at that point, they took them in. And well, that's a whole other terrible, horrible story that happened there. But that was the beginning for me of intensely disliking Mr. Perry, because he made these arbitrary decisions about lives of people that he didn't know, didn't care about. And then the other thing he did was to agree to the privatization of prisons. And that was one of the ways that he sidestepped any of the benefits or long-term, long-range benefits of the consent decree. Is he said, well, let's open private prisons, and then we don't have to really be held to that same standard, although there is some commission that they all have to get accredited by. But it was that, and then there was something else. It was a law, a federal law. Right now the name escapes me, but they passed a federal law. He might have had something to do with it. Let's blame him anyway. But this federal law states that prisoners cannot sue, because like Dwight Duran sued, and they couldn't sue the state, so that's why they had to sue the governor and the Department of Correction, individuals, because you can't sue the state. But this federal law said that they had to exhaust, there's like 4 tenets to this law. They had to exhaust all of their processes. So they had to do a kite. They had to contact their supervisor. And it had to go all the way up the chain of command. So they had to take that step first.
Kite is an administrative grievance. It's a slang term.
Thank you, gosh. You never shake loose of that stuff. Okay, so then they had to do that, and they had to be able to prove it, seriously prove that they had taken all these steps. They had to pay in total the fees for the court filings, and they had to be able to prove that they had paid it or that they had made arrangements with the court to pay it. So all these things that they did to prevent prisoners from filing and doing these consent decrees like they had done. So it was those kind of things that we were always on the watch out for, and that we were always, just amazed. Every step we took, every turn we took. And, you know, we weren't radicals. we were just, you know, a bunch of women and family members struggling to deal with this system. And it was really tough. But every step we took, you know, it seemed like Mr. Perry and that mentality, they were right there, like, you know, a mile ahead of us, not just a couple steps. They were like miles beyond. And by the way, I'm sure that you all know that Mr. Perry is my alumni. Yes, he is. He's a graduate of UNM. Yeah, I just read that today. I was kind of surprised and somewhat disappointed. But anyway, thank you. That's what I wanted to talk to you about and let you know that there are families who struggle in the prison, and I'm sure that there are many family members who have suffered at the hands of APD who are struggling today to come to terms with some of this stuff that's happening. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for sharing. You know, we just kind of wanted to offer some context to folks as we enter a new consent decree process with the Department of Justice. You know, it's not a new, you know, we've gone through a consent decree process previously, and so hopefully there's lessons to be learned from folks like Mo who were involved and kind of can give detail of like what are some steps that communities can take to push back, to insert themselves into the consent decree process so that it's not just Perry and Barry and Eden at the table with the Department of Justice. So thank you guys so much for sharing that perspective and offering some kind of community grounding. So I'm going to turn it over to Emma.
All right. Thanks, Lucille. I really appreciate your story about your son being institutionalized in the process of that. I know as a mother myself that young men of color are definitely not excluded from a history of being criminalized by our police in our state. And as a young person myself too, young people have throughout our history have been criminalized and have faced many different issues in relationship to policing, being pipelined all the way from high schools, being arrested on high schools with cops that carry guns, and all these different issues around where young people are being shuttled from schools right into the juvenile detention centers. And we know once they get in there, their lives are going to forever be institutionalized. We're never going to see them move out of any different spaces. As a mom, that's pretty concerning for me. As a person that's pretty young myself and that works with other young people, that's pretty concerning for me. And so we're going to give it up to Fernando to talk a little bit about the history of the criminalization of youth inside Burke and some of the work that he did as an organizer with SWOP.
Hi guys, Fernando. Like I said, I used to be a community organizer with the Southwest Organizing Project a while back, mid-90s, early 2000s. I was kind of coming out of a generation that was pretty darn violent in a lot of ways. Now that I'm a little bit older and can look back and have a little bit of a different perspective on things. But we were, no doubt about it. It was like the middle of the gang banging phase. Everybody wanted to be a gangster. And so young people, and definitely not just young people of color, were all in the streets all over the place, in a lot of ways, acting out like young people do. It just so happened that it was during that time, and that's what a lot of people were doing. There was really no focus in positive things at the time. We didn't have a lot of outlets because young people were in the streets, kind of gangbanging. You know, you had this whole media thing that was behind it. You know, you had movies coming out, Bound by Honor, Blood In, Blood Out, American Me. You had Menace to Society, Boys in the Hood. Everything from that area was about young people of color killing each other. So there was a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there because we did, on major levels, we were killing each other. In fact, the way that I got involved in the Southwest Organizing Project was because I was kind of headed down that path. Got in trouble for some nonsense, went to the D home for a little while, got out. Somebody called me from the Southwest Organizing Project, or maybe through Michael, said, hey, we need a chili sign painted for our annual chili harvest fiesta. You're kicked out of school at the time, you have no job, you're gonna paint this sign for us. So I painted the sign, had absolutely no idea what the Southwest Organizing Project was about, but I painted the sign and I had to take the sign to a meeting. So here I am at this meeting, and they're talking about APS issues, the Albuquerque Public Schools and things that were taking place in APS. I knew everything that was taking place in APS because I was there, living it, seeing it, but I had no idea that organizations like the Southwest Organizing Project existed, or that they had an open door for young people like me. So immediately, being a young person with a lot of fire, a lot of drive, a lot of attitude, I see what's going on in this meeting. Then later on, I got invited to a school board meeting and asked to speak. And when I realized that that a small handful of people, there was a couple of young people, a lot of older people there, that we were able to create at least some amount of social consciousness. Somebody was paying attention a little bit to what was going on with young people of color in the hood. And nobody had done that. I had never seen anybody do that and be proactive in saying, this is what we want, this is what we do. If now you're gonna have to hear it from us, and we're gonna hold you accountable, and we expect change. So what we started talking about, it almost kind of started out, well, let's start talking to young people, right? Because we have a handful of young people that are saying some things, but let's get an idea of what everybody across the board is saying. So we decided, let's start having a couple of community meetings. We're gonna have, let's break it down by high school, right? If we go out and we reach out to every high school, then we're gonna get a pretty good idea of what the demographic is. So we started talking to people at high schools. Obviously, there was a difference between the schools that we were going to and talking to people in the Heights than there were, you know, throughout the entire valley, throughout the hood. So that was obvious. That was clear. So around that, we started, you know, identifying leadership, young people who wanted to come together and talk about these same kind of issues. And at that point, it was just in the talking phase. We got a lot of young people to start talking about the way that they were treating people in malls, right? They used to have a policy that said that young people couldn't be in more than groups of whatever, 2 on the weekdays, 3 on the weekends, something like that, without a parent or guardian. The way that they were enforcing this, though, obviously was not across the board. Young people of color were getting pulled in the hallways left and right, getting searched, not allowed to call parents, not allowed to call lawyers, not allowed to call anybody, getting their pictures taken, facial pictures, body pictures, tattoos. It was constant. And we were seeing them. I mean, they were literally dragging groups of young people off. And every single one of these groups of young people, in a lot of ways, looked like me. So it was obvious that there's something going on here. And as young people, I mean, we knew that there was something funky going on in the way that APD treated us, and the way that security officers treated us in these different places or whatever, but we never really internalized it or took the time to think about it or think that we could do anything about it. So we had a lot of discussions about that. One of the things was the malls. We had that issue come up. We had APS. There was issues all over APS when we started thinking about the criminalization of young people in public schools and what that looked like. There was APD, obvious one again, but we kind of in the beginning phases of that started thinking, okay, well, what can we realistically take on? What's our fight going to be? We didn't really want to jump on APD at the time. Even 15 years ago, we could have jumped on them for all these same issues that we're talking about now. It seemed like it was a little above and beyond us at that point. So we started really looking at that mall issue and thinking that it's the same mentality. The same mentality that these security guards have in the mall is the same exact mentality that they have on West Central. Every, you know, community in Albuquerque that young people were hanging out in, young people were getting abused, young people's rights were being violated, young people were getting detained without parents knowing for days. I mean, it was just crazy things going on. People finding their kids 3 days later in the D home without a call. Nutty things were going on. Anyway, these kinds of things were being discussed. We took on that issue at Coronado Mall. It was all of the mall. It was Winrock as well, but it was Coronado Mall specifically that we were focusing on. And we got a group of young people to start organizing, and I think we mobilized maybe
couple hundred people for each action that we had at Coronado Mall. I remember one of them was real cool. We printed up a bunch of brown dollars and sent a ton of young people into the mall and went to every single merchant that was in there and threw a couple $100s of our brown dollars on the table and said, this is what we would have spent, but we're not going to because you work in a place that has this policy. And it made a huge impact, not only for our young people, but for our community as a whole, I think. I think that it had been kind of a little while that young people of color had actually stood up and called a one-day boycott of a place that they frequent on a daily basis. We had a real good, solid group of people who were willing to step back from Coronado Mall and actually do something positive. So that's kind of where it all kicked off. And then from there, we got into APS, started working on one of their biggest issues, along with the APD issue that we're talking about, was the fact that APS wanted to arm their security guards with shotguns and tasers. I think it was like $250,000 or something like that they were going to pay for them. Just pay for them. I mean, they didn't even mention training or anything like that. But they were going to just buy these weapons, hand them off to their 20-some officers that they had at the time or whatever, and just let them go for it. They really, really wanted to be separate from APD. They wanted their own police department over there at APS. And we were saying, wait a minute, who are these guys? I mean, we don't know where they come from. We don't know what their credentials are like. They're not cops. They're not exactly security guards. Who are they? Are they qualified to hold a pistol? Can they shoot a shotgun? I mean, there's all these different things going on, and we got to remember that Columbine had just happened. So we're dealing with the violence issue on top of the fact that, and a lot of young people had just died, and everybody was feeling it nationwide. And obviously we should have, but what we were screaming was, young people of color die every single day in these streets, and nobody has given a damn. Until Columbine happened. And it's almost like one of those things like, I hated Columbine because it made young people look violent, but it kind of shined this national spotlight on what was going on across the nation, and we played into that perfectly. And we turned a tragic thing into a positive thing and saying, but we can create change. We're not violent as a whole community of young people, so you don't have to police us in an institution of learning. That was one of our main things, is that these are institutions of learning, and you're calling us super predators. You're sticking guns in our faces, and you're expecting us to achieve, what it was exactly, an education that is free of all of that. That's why our parents sent us to school. We found out in the streets as we were knocking on doors with parents, educators, a lot of young people, that nobody really felt scared at school. Nobody was saying, we need those guns, guys. That never, ever came up. It was just this national frenzy of young people of color, quote unquote super predators, and we got to nip that in the bud. So we started attending everything. We were at every single school board meeting possible for a really long time. It was a pretty good battle. I think it was maybe 2 years. We were back and forth. Protest after protest, walk out, sit in. We did a lot of work in the streets at that time around this APS thing. And what it finally came down to, and which was a huge thing for the young people in this organization and for a lot of the young people in this city, is that we won. They voted not to arm these guys. We got them. Until in 2011, another mass shooting again. They passed it.
This time they're cops, and they have Dodge Chargers in case they have to chase kids on their bikes.
There you go. There you go. So but it worked. A group of young people, we recognized it, we did something about it. It was possible. The organizing effort was a success. At that point, it kind of built up, and we said, all right, we got some air under our wings.
let's take on APD. APD at the time, they had the gang unit. Gang unit was 5 guys. 5 guys wore jackets that said gang unit.
It's a noose for a logo.
Yeah, right? At that point they didn't, but they should have. They were copying, I'm not gonna even try to say, I wanna say it was like 2.5 million, something like that, from the Department of Family and Community Services. It wasn't even going through the department that it should have. They were copying money from what should have been going into community centers, parks, things like that, but they were dubbing the Albuquerque gang unit as a community project specifically for young people, like, here you go, you know? Right. So that was almost kind of an easy target, right? Everybody can understand, wait a minute. You know, you got the Department of Family and Community Services is claiming that they can't give us a couple $1,000 to put some pens and some computers and stuff like that in these classrooms or whatever in these community centers. But we're going to give up a couple $1 million to have the police department harass us and profile us. There was nothing different. So our connection to the whole thing was we went back to, you know, the Zoot Suit riots of the 1940s. Young people wearing baggy clothes, a pair of Chuck Taylors, and sleeved up arms was no different than the stereotypical Chicano from the 1940s, which was the Zoot Suit, the feather, the whatever. It's how we recognized each other. It's how we communicated as young people. It's how we expressed ourselves, and we were 100% being targeted for it. When it was all said and done, when we were dealing with this, just one thing I wanted to throw out there because I always think it's nuts. The gang unit never had a concrete definition of what a gang member was. So it was an all-out, round them up, and all over West Central, downtown, the communities in Barelas around the zoo, everybody used to cruise and barbecue all the time. They would come in and block down 8-block radius and round young people up. If it got close to curfew time, because we also had the citywide curfew, if anybody under the age of 18 was found outside after midnight, they were going to jail. And it was the same thing. They were rounding them up into behind closed doors, searching, taking pictures, questioning. I mean, it was nuts. So all of that was going on at that time. The thing with APD, we didn't, at least I didn't, end up seeing an end to that campaign. But what ended up happening in that campaign is they started to get worried. The city started to get worried. APD started to get worried. At the time, it was Gil Gallegos, who was a police chief. And the man hated us and everything that we were saying and doing. And I remember we decided to have an action, a protest at City Hall. And we didn't plan it to go down the way it went down, but it just kind of happened to go down this way. Yeah, we instigated for sure. But what ended up happening is all we wanted was a meeting with the mayor. Simply a meeting with the mayor. That was it, to discuss all these different issues, the budgetary stuff, the things that APD were doing. It was about 150 of us were outside. We just wanted to talk. So what ended up happening was we got called up for the meeting, but they only wanted a couple of us. We said, we want as many as possible to represent us, right? We go up, they say, mayor's not here. You know, he's on vacation, he's not coming back for a couple of weeks, right? We kind of figured that was gonna happen. We said, well, look, you've got about 5 or 6 different department heads sitting right here. We're not leaving until we meet with every single one of them. And if you can't get the mayor. Well, what happened was one of our props was crime scene tape, because we were gonna serve the mayor with a warrant for his arrest for some of the things that Richard was talking about, you know, assault on our young people, misallocation of robbery, misallocation of funds, public money, and all these different things we're going to charge him with. Well, we decided to put crime scene tape all over the, I don't know, he was in the 9th floor of City Hall or whatever, to represent a crime had taken place.
Well, people started coming out of their offices saying, "Oh my God, did someone get shot?" I mean, there's cops everywhere, there's crime scene tape everywhere. City Hall just starts to funnel out. So they say, "We're shutting down City Hall because we don't know what happened." So it was awesome that we can claim that we shut down City Hall for a little while, but it was really awesome in the fact that we got that meeting with all 5 department heads. It was organized and led by young people. I may have been one of the oldest people working on that campaign, and I was only 22 years old. If that says anything about what young people are capable of what our people or oppressed people are capable of doing, regardless of what the environment or the atmosphere seems to dictate, right? Like, we can't do or say anything because we might get shot. Never that. I refuse to buy into it. I hope that every organization in this city refuses to buy into it. I hope that every young person out there that is lucky enough to hear some of the people in here speak or spread their message don't buy into it. I pray to God my daughter never buys into it. Cops are people like us. I know that they're armed. I know that they can be intimidating. I know that they have a record of doing this. But the fact of the matter is they're people. And I have knowledge, and we have knowledge, and our young people have knowledge, and that is our best protection. Because as many times as I have stepped on a cop's toes, I'm okay. And the reason why I feel like I've been lucky enough to be okay is because of that knowledge and the understanding that there's organizations like the Southwest Organizing Project and organizations like the Black Berets that did it before me, and ultimately we're okay. And I would just say in closing that my biggest message that I wanted to bring here today is that don't let it be a trend, right? Don't let these recent shootings by APD and the things that we've been hearing in the news and everything like that for a second, it's like a shot, goes down, feels good, we got our high, we're done. My biggest thing is I've been out of the game for a while. I have not been organizing for a while. And I sit back and again, this is without having a lot of communication with the people that I used to. I fear that we waited till it got hot. Now we're gonna get hot, then we're gonna go away. And I would just like to say, please don't. You know, even if I can't take the lead on any kind of an organizing strategy right now, or some of us as individuals can't because we have our own lives to live and we got bills to pay. I get that, but keep doing this. Keep doing this, because this really does make me feel good. It has been a long time since I've been in the game, and it's really cool to see people focused and caring, you know what I'm saying? And shoot, fight the good fight. I'll have you guys' back any day of the week. And,
thank you, Fernando, and some of the youth organizers, some of whom are still around SWOP, and still around in the movement, doing other things. People have gone to law school and all kinds of stuff, which is really interesting. One thing that Fernando left out is that there was a period in time where Mayor Marty Chavez was calling us terrorists. So, you know, and you don't really make it until the mayor calls you out by name.
One thing that I did want to say, and that was another thing I was going to point out, and I'm glad you brought that up, is that is that the organizing effort, I do like what's been going on. I've been watching the news and stuff, and I never saw one person or one representative of what was going on the streets being focused in on the news, and I liked that. What I say, and because it did get a little bit crazy at times there towards the end of that campaign, where there were cops hanging out outside of SWOP. You know, I was getting some funky calls. Gene Gauna was really concerned that, you know, maybe we should tone down a little bit, at least just for a little while. You know, it was a real hectic time because we were talking about everything, the war in Iraq, we were doing a bunch of stuff like that. But what ended up happening a lot of, and this is in reflecting with a lot of people that I did used to work with the Southwest Organizing Project over the years, is that when that one person becomes the face of that mentality, or I don't want to say movement as a whole, but once people start identifying what's going on with one specific person, then you start to kind of lose that message. And you start to bring a lot of heat on that one or two people, right? Because definitely we felt it. And so that's what I would say is, if it was, when it comes to young people, especially in organizing, keep it a collective and keep it, you know, obviously we're trying to build leadership, but we don't want to single people out. I guess what I'm trying to say is not everybody has to be the martyr. We definitely don't want to create more martyrs. We do want to create leaders. So when we have an outspoken young person that can really take the bull by the horns, let's try and not let that one young person take that bull by the horns all the time. You know what I mean?
There's times to take the bull by the horns, there's times to get out of the bull's way. So as we kind of so we're trying to take us through a progression and a timeline, you know, back, like Richard said, 50 years. You know, and so we've all kind of experienced over the last few weeks what's happening with APD, obviously the murders of James Boyd, Alfred Redwine, and now Mary Hawks over the last 5 or 6 weeks. And so, you know, we kind of all know the story, and we asked Dr. Correa to come, as he's been one of the folks, a really vocal supporter of the protesters, and a really vocal kind of person talking about what's happening. So I just want him to kind of help us to talk a little bit about what's happening, but I feel like we've already kind of beaten that horse a little bit. You know, we know that they've murdered 28, 29, however many folks, you know, and then all of the other ones that, you know, aren't considered suspicious, but they're suspicious to us, you know, and there's a whole score of other things that's all kind of interrelated in the failure of the system. You know, when we start talking about the women on the West Mesa, what happened to that case? You know, and the failure of the department and the administration to do anything about it. The Jonathan Mitchell case of a young African-American serviceman who was killed literally in his front yard and allowed to bleed to death. There's constant, you know, stories like Richard said at the beginning. We could sit here all night and name all the folks, and I'm really glad that you brought these pictures so we can put faces to names so that it's not just numbers. You know, these are family members, they're brothers, and at this point a sister. Who will no longer go home. They're not going to have their family gatherings. They're not going to be able to participate in Christmas and Easter. So I thank you for bringing the banner, and I want to turn it over to Dr. Correa to just help us kind of think about it in the modern context and like what's happening right now, and what is the institutional failure, and how can the community kind of get behind the reform efforts.
Thanks very much. And first, let me say that we're comrades here, so I'm David. The only people I may call me doctor is like District Attorney Brandenburg. She has to call me doctor. Mayor, for example. And I've actually done that. She tried to call me Mr. I said, no, it's doctor to you, Ms. Brandenburg. So, you know, Rodrigo SWOP asked me to talk about what's happening right now, really in this context that we've been hearing. And you know, I was really introduced to this. I think actually one of the first people that introduced me to this was Richard. I think I talked to Richard, this like mid-2000s, and you know, I've spent a lot of time researching and writing about people like Larry Casus and Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova and others, and really courageous people that gave their lives. Well, their lives were taken from them. They didn't give their lives. And I think it's important, what I've tried to do in the work I do, in the stories I tell, in the book I wrote, was to really, people just don't believe that this is a ruthless and relentless pattern of violence against people of color and poor people, and that's what it is. And, you know, listen, when Alianza was organizing in Albuquerque and bombs went off, a bomb went off at their headquarters, right north of downtown. It was a U.S. Marshal who put the bomb there and blew his own hand up, right? The FBI were infiltrating, and the New Mexico State Police were infiltrating the Black Berets, Alianza and others, and I've read those files, those Freedom of Information files. I know that history. You know, the New Mexico State Police had a campaign of infiltration, right? And the point of it was to provoke violence so then they could return violence against people. J. Edgar Hoover himself supervised a campaign of violence, this violent campaign against Alianza and all of its members, right? And you know, if you're interested in history, I can give you a title to read, and I'll let you read that. But I want to talk very specifically about APD here, and let's, you know, one of the things that we've been doing as we've been organizing over the last month is we've been trying to interrupt every one of these narratives that tries to make this some sort of unique crisis, that it's somehow not connected to all these stories that we're telling here. And one of the things is, why are we telling the story from 2010? Right, there's 25 people, actually there's more. There's people that have been killed that police have said have killed themselves and they don't count, and that number they count. But let's go back, right? Let's go back, let's start. I don't want to go as far back, so let's just go back to like 1987. Okay, 1987 to 1997, APD killed 31 people, okay? Provoked a crisis, the same crisis we find ourselves in right now, that produced a report. Many of you are familiar with the Walker-Luna report. I was reading the Walker-Luna report today again, and I was thinking I was imagining myself talking to someone and quoting this report, and I would say to you, I want to read a passage of a report on police violence. And if I did that to you and you had read the DOJ report, you would say, did the DOJ report, did they just crib the Walker-Luna report? Did they just cut and paste? Because it's the same things that the Walker-Luna report was saying in 96, right? So here's what's really important, I think we have to remember, and I think that too often when we're involved in these sort of moments of crisis, and it was an intense story you were telling, Fernando, and this last month has been pretty intense, right? We ask ourselves, how can we keep up this energy? This is impossible. I've been to meetings. It's not a meeting. It's a protest. It's an organizational meeting where it's writing an article. It's talking on the phone. And how do we keep this up? The problem, as I see it, and I want to make this argument really clear, is not that anybody in this room is doing anything wrong, right? It's not that we've lost the energy. It's not like anything happened in 96, that anyone that really cared did anything wrong. Here's the problem that happened in 96. People started to courageously tell the truth. People refused to pretend like it wasn't a problem. People called it like they saw it, right? Like Richard did, like Joaquin has done, and then in 96, it was impossible for the people that were in charge to pretend like there was nothing wrong, right? Suddenly they had to admit, okay, well, I guess there's a problem. I guess we were killing too many people, right? What are we going to do about that? Yeah. But here's what happened with the Walker-Luna report and the reforms that came after it, right? What happens is then the truth tellers that we are, the ones that stand up and refuse to pretend like it's not a problem, that people are dying, they're poor, they're people of color, then all of a sudden, the people that put those elected officials in office start to say, well, we've got to find common ground. We can't just let these extremists, these critics of APD, these extremists, suddenly we're extremists, right? You're more radical than you think, so that's what that means. Right. Well, it's true, and also that would represent it that way. But and suddenly it's this search for common ground, and it's like, and I'm going to tell you something very much. Right? I was raised an Episcopalian. I don't practice. I'm not religious anymore. But a lot of the faith community, right? I'm going to be honest with you. They're uncomfortable facing this truth. It hurts. Suddenly we all have a moral responsibility that makes too many of us uncomfortable. Right? You're in this room, so this doesn't make you uncomfortable, but it makes too many people uncomfortable. And how do we blunt that trauma? What can we do we don't want to demonize the cops, because everyone's got a brother and uncle. My grandfather was a cop, my brother-in-law was a cop. I would never be a cop, right? But I write about the law, right? So we don't want to hurt their feelings. We got to find common ground. And so what ends up happening is reform instead of the structural change that Richard was talking about, right? That's what happens. And we all feel better about it. And we feel like, well, we did something that's really great, right? And that's what happened in 97. So after the Walker-Luna report, this coalescing sense of, well, we got to do something, but we don't want to hurt their feelings. We don't want to listen to these extremists over here at SWOP. I mean, come on. So what happens is, well, we're going to create this police oversight commission and this independent review officer, and that's really all that happened. That's all that happened in 97. And then APD killed 23 people in 6 years, till 2004. They actually increased the rate at which they killed people after the crisis of the Walker-Luna report, okay? And then between 2004 and 2010, more than a dozen people were killed, okay? These are not We're not in a crisis, we've been in a crisis. We're always in a crisis. If you're poor, if you're a person of color in the city, you are gonna eventually come into violent conflict with the police. That's what Fernando's telling us, that's what Richard and Joaquin are talking about. Lucille, you've told that story about your son. That's the truth that is experienced unevenly. And so it's the faith communities that don't have sons in jail, that don't have cousins that have been harassed by police, that haven't themselves been harassed by police. They care, but they don't experience that personally. They can't, the way that they feel comfortable expressing their outrage is through the same political channels that Perry and Barry rely on to keep their power their own, right? So what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? Here's what we have to do about this. Don't make us the extremists in it, right? I mean, we can't be the ones saying these things in public. We can't be the ones, like Fernando's saying, there can't be just a few people. We all have to step up and say, we all have a moral obligation, every single one of us, and we can't turn our eyes from that. And that doesn't make us extremists, right? Why am I an activist? Because I don't like people getting killed by police. Well, how does that make me an activist, right? Look, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm pretty secure. I'm pretty secure. Like, I have a job. I have the time to do this. I know it's hard for a lot of people. I'm in a privileged position. But, listen, I'm experiencing the same sorts of intimidation. Like, no one's, when Richard was and Joaquin were organizing, cops would pull by them and you know, we're going to come get you, right? I just get intimidating emails from the district attorney. And, you know, she's frankly not all that frightening. Mostly because she doesn't actually indict anybody, so I can't really be scared of her, right? No. But so this is the point I want to make. I think that one of the things that I was asked to talk about was like, what do we have to do now to make sure that we're not just at the cusp of another violent pattern? And if the answer, if the consent decree is a reform decree, if it's all about reform, if it's just fix the training, hire that person, fire that person, you know, if that's what it is, and that's by the way what the DOJ does in these consent decrees, and if you've read their other consent decrees, that's what they do. They don't care about structural issues, right? That's not their job. They want to focus on this very small thing. If that's all it is, then keep counting, because we're going to watch people dying in the streets still. And so I think it's got to be about, this isn't an extreme position. I'm not condemning individual cops. I think cops are trained to be this way, and they're entering a police department that makes it impossible to be a good cop. This is structural, right? And we have laws that make it almost certain that poor people, homeless, if you suffer from mental illness, you are eventually going to find yourself in a violent confrontation with the police. That's the world we've built. That's the world we've built, and we have an obligation to disassemble that world and build a new one. And we're not going to build that new world if we are relying on the same sorts of like political movements that keep getting us into this position. The ones that think the system that produced this violence can somehow be a part of undoing this violence. We're never going to get out of it. So I think we've got to keep this pressure on, and the pressure has to be, we're talking about the truth. This isn't an extreme criticism. We're not on the radical left here. I am, it's true, but I mean, listen, I'm coming into contact with people from all over the political spectrum that agree on this. Right? That's how we have to make this movement. It has to be broad-based, and we can't let it be the radical movement that some sort of reform movement uses as the power that gets them into the offices of the mayor and does all the negotiating. Because I'll tell you, that's what's happening right now. That's precisely what's happening right now. Right? Did you see in the news when Barry just said, well, he was in with community leaders yesterday, right? I don't know who those community leaders are. They wouldn't name those community leaders. This is the equivalent of the snitch house, I think. Right? Those community leaders. Right? They're not our community leaders. They're not the ones that are actually levying these criticisms and making it stick and refusing to be called this extremists. Because how is it extreme to want a police department that doesn't kill people?
So, thanks, David. You guys are all like amazing. I just want to thank you all for your time.
More gratitude and appreciation to all our panelists. We wanted to give you guys a SWOP bandana to say thank you all so much for continuing to not telling your stories, telling the community about the history of violence that's happened inside of our communities, but also for continuing the fight in the struggle.
You
So
get to pick your color.
Yeah, pick your color.
So we do have just a couple minutes if we had wanted to take some questions from the audience. I think we have a wireless mic. What, can you try that mic? And we'll, just a couple of questions. We do have to get out of here soon, so we don't want to be here, all night. But if you have questions specifically for the panelists about anything that you heard here tonight, we will be happy to kind of answer them as best as we can. So, Marisol is walking around with the mic. Raise your hand. Okay. Are we ready? All right, let's go.
I'm Katie Mack. Is this on?
Will you make sure the green light on the bottom is on?
No green light.
Light your bottom.
No, I have a pretty loud voice.
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, I'm Katie Mathis, and I'm really, really glad that I got here today. My question briefly is, what step-by-step structural changes would you like to see? I, for one, would like to see the police trained in nonviolence and lethal guns replaced by tranquilizer guns and that kind of thing. Why do they have to use, guns to kill people?
So the question is, what are the structural changes and institutional changes that we can take to prevent police violence in the future? So I want to ask Mo to answer this one first because he seems like he's in the best position to do something about it, seeing as he's on the Judiciary Committee.
What I think what needs to happen is the chief, the deputy chief, and all the commanders need to go. They need to all go. Anybody with any black on their uniform needs to go. And we need people from out of state that are committed to a constitutional police force that don't know a soul, that aren't beholden to anybody, that aren't related or went to college or went to the academy. We need people that don't know any of these cops. And then everybody 0 to 5, all the APD cops 0 to 5 need to be. And that was an excellent point. They don't need to be. They don't need more training. They need retraining. And what they do is they use these simulator models where this one guy was 21 feet away from a cop. I think it was in Memphis. He had a knife and he managed to stab the cop. Out of the 100,000 instances where a guy has a sharp object, this one guy managed to get in there before the cop defended himself. They use that as the model for self-defense. That if they're trained that if someone's within 21 feet of you with a knife, you get to kill him. That's why when Eden didn't talk about cops being scared or whatever. He says, well, pursuant to Tennessee v. Gardner, it was a good kill. It's
good kill. Oh my God.
So that's what I think, because it's systemic. It is systemic within the department. How dare you criticize us? Unless you're a cop, how dare you? You don't know what we go through. How dare you criticize us? And then when cops hang out with cops. In the briefing room, they hang out with cops. Then they have a barbecue on the weekend. They watch football, and guess who's there? Cops. So they don't get it. They're isolated from the community, and they're entrenched in their view of their own self-righteousness, and it needs to be undone. I don't know. That's what I think.
Any of the other panelists want to talk about structural changes?
Yeah, one of the things that the police departments always push back against is independent police oversight. And one of the ways they've done that, almost every city in the country makes it actually legally impossible to do actual independent police oversight because the ordinance, the city charters make it impossible we'd have to change the charter. So this is what happened with the Walker-Lewin report. Even 2 years after the Walker-Lewin report, a former DOJ lawyer did a study, and already they were saying this isn't working the way we wanted it to work. And the reason was because it was not independent. It was immediately brought into the sort of political structure in City Hall, and the independent review officer, Robin Hammer's not the first fake independent review officer, or the first one that can't do their job. And so, but here's the thing, the way to push back on this is, there was independent police oversight in the progressive era. right? It was common. Police departments were beholden to the community, and these were not police officers. They had no connection to the police office. They were not appointed by the mayors or the city councils. They had their own budgets. They had their own authority. They could charge officers. They could fire officers. This was common in the progressive era.
When? When was that?
This was in but basically we're talking about the 1920s, right? The 1920s and before. So this is yeah, it's a long time ago. But that was eroded with this whole only the police can police the police. If you don't walk in my shoes, you don't know how to do my job. All that kind of stuff, which we must reject, right? Because every one of us in this room has whatever specialized knowledge we have from the things we do, and yet you do that as part of a community. And so what the police do is a part of this community, and if we let them tell us that it's something different, it requires some sort of specialized knowledge that only we have and you don't, then we can never get over the hump that we have to, which is, no, you don't have any specialized knowledge. You have nothing that, in fact, it's the lack of knowledge that the police have about this community that makes this the problem.
Yeah.
So, let's have one more comment, and then we'll take Charles, and if anybody else has any questions, just raise your hands, and I'll put you on the stand.
Hi, Charles. I'll be brief. Hi. I wanted to let you know two things. My brother trained to be in Houston with the Sheriff's Department. So they sent him to their police academy. And he said that the first thing they tell you when you walk in the door that it's going to be you versus them being the population. And he said, yeah, and he said that, so you spend, I think it was 18 weeks, and they indoctrinate you. And he said, or in other words, they brainwash you, that you were better than these people. You're smarter, faster, stronger. You are the elite of the elite. And you shouldn't take any crap from anybody, and they should do what you say. And so it really, he said, was an intense situation. And ultimately, he decided to stay in the military, which was, not so intense. but he did not become a cop. But he says that he was shocked and amazed at the kind of indoctrination and training that they get. And so then the second point I wanted to make was he was telling me that I would be shocked at the number of government agencies who have their own police force. So of course I never believe what he says until I Google it. So I looked it up. Okay, and I'm going to give you a brief list. This isn't half of it, and the ones I remember. NASA has their own police force. Well, I can see if you terrorists want to go attack NASA, they need a police force. We all know that the Department of Education in almost every state has their own police force. The Forest Service, I knew that. My sisters worked for them for 30 years. BLM, I did not know that. And there was one more that I can't remember, but it's interesting that we are getting used to this. We are acclimated to live in a police state. Yeah, and that's what I was like, oh wow, I never knew that. And when you think about it, yeah, everywhere we go, someone tells us what to do, how to do it, when to do it. I mean, we live in society, we want to get along, but the police are out of control, and they're giving and getting more and more and more power. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucille. I'm going to have to go soon, but I wanted to tell you about the rally that's coming up on Monday, April 28th at 5 o'clock, a Justice for Jonathan rally. It's at the DA's office, which is 520 Lomas Northwest, across from Metro Court. Jonathan was not killed by APD. However, they played a major part in his death. When they arrived on the scene after Jonathan was shot, lying there bleeding, his brother, applying pressure, trying to stop the bleeding, APD seized his brother, cuffed him, and then left Jonathan to lie there and bleed to death. We feel that there hasn't been an adequate investigation of this. The vigilante has not been held accountable. APD has not been held accountable. And so we're trying to put pressure on the DA to bring charges. And we also want Jonathan's killing, although not directly caused by the police, it should be a part of the investigation of the police. Again, the rally is Monday, the 28th, and at 520 Lomas Northwest, the DA's office.
What time?
At 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock. And they will have some of these posters there, so people who arrive early should be able to get a poster to help them spread the word. If you think you know what happened in this case by listening to the news, you're only getting one side of it. They, in the news, are quickly to point out that they say that Jonathan fired first, but they don't talk about the stalking that went on before this. The shooter was driving by Jonathan's house more than once, I don't know how many times, with his lights off on the wrong side of the road, and then he stopped at the edge of Jonathan's driveway. And apparently Jonathan, they say, fired first, but his brother says that the shots were so close that they were almost simultaneous. So it was like the shooter was already taking aim when Jonathan fired. So it should be investigated, and the police should be held accountable for this man's death. So if you have a chance, come out to the rally. Up till now, I've gone to several rallies in support of Jonathan Mitchell, Justice for Jonathan, and they've been not that well attended. It's been mainly family and friends that have been out there. So if you have the time and the inclination, please come out on Monday.
Thank you, Charles. Let me back this mic over to Richard.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just as we continue, just have people think about something. One of those things I think for organizers need to spend a lot of time listening to our members in the community and see how they're defining this issue themselves. That's very, very, very important. For those of us living in the South Valley particularly, we deal with 5 different police agencies there, so I want us to be real clear about that. We deal with the state police, the sheriff's department, the Albuquerque Police Department. Then in the wintertime, we got what we call the smokestack police. They're the ones that come by and put the light up, the flashlight up at night to see if you're burning wood on a non-burn night. Now, if they see anything suspicious, though they're coming through the neighborhood, they actually report it very, very quickly. And then for those of us who live close to the river, then we got the Bosque Police and some of the people that control that. For those of us that live close to the railroad tracks, there's also the train folk have their own police department too. So some of those are patrolling those tracks in some of those areas. So we're dealing with a whole lot of a different kind of militarization that we're really speaking about here. I think that the other thing is, and we try to really talk about this. For many of us that have been involved for a while, if we're going to get involved in this police issue, we better be prepared to be in for the long haul. This ain't a short-range struggle by any means. If we think it is, then we're going to find out very clearly, because we've been talking in some cases about 50 years ago, and actually we could have went back another 50 or 100 or another 100 or whatever and continued to do that. This is a very, very clearly a very, very long haul. I think the other thing is that we need to be extremely cautious that we don't get pitted against each other. For us in our organization and so on, we decide who our leaders are. The police department, the mayor, Perry, Susana Martinez, or whoever does not decide for us who the leadership of our organization is and who represents our issues. And so very, very clearly then, when they're defining who community leaders are, when they're saying that they're meeting with community leaders, then we need to be just a little cautious about that and see who our appointed leaders in some cases have been. The others is we don't have to agree with each other all the time, but can we just every once in a while come together around something? Can we just, as we really be honest with each other, put our egos and our bullshit to the side for a minute and get out and support these families that have been at that city council meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, when some, and maybe in some cases, didn't want to be there because they were afraid that they may lose their grant or whatever. You know, we catch a little bit of, you know, we talk truth to power, and based upon that, sometimes we don't make everybody so happy in the process of doing that, even some of our own. And I say that because these families are to be incredibly highly respected. They have been there after day after day after day after day. And in many cases, in some cases, they were some of the very few that was at that city council meeting. And we just need to keep that in mind. We're talking about moving forward, not moving backward. We're talking about building unity. We're talking about the kind of movement that's necessary to make the significant kind of change that we're talking about. So, I mean, I just need to say those things because at times, as I said, we need to put our egos to the side and we need to move forward in a real way to be able to deal with some of these issues. I think the others for us is that whether that brother or not that was shot at 5 points, whether he was a parole violator, whatever that may have been, he didn't deserve to get shot the way he did, okay? So let's not judge even him before the fact, you know, and let the media, I know the media only started coming forward very, very recently. You know, and I have to say this about some of our elected officials. Now, you know, we're going to put it where it really needs to be. Some of those city councilors could have put a little bit of a jolt into this situation a time back, you know, and they didn't do it. And they need to be held responsible for this. You know? I mean, they had the opportunity to deal with it. Now, I just want to say that, and Mo is a person that we've known for quite a few years, and we know what Mo's commitment is before he became an elected official. So we got some very good elected officials out there, but we got some others that are in positions or whatever of authority, and they need to come to the table too. Whether it's Uriel, Heinrich, whoever all these people are, they need to remember who their constituency is, you know, and based upon that. So I just say as truthful as we can say it, as my son told me, you know, hey Pops, I'm real concerned about going to that meeting, you know, because if I get pinned as one of those people that talk there, who's going to be there one day when we need to be watching and taking care of each other's back? That's a real question about that, no? So we need some real consistency. We need short range, middle range, and long range consistency in terms of making these issues the real ones that we're talking about. No? So those are very, I mean, I think very, very important for us. None of us have ever given anything up. I was with Dickie Sautel, Richard Sautel today, one of the Black Berets. Spent, you know, as Joaquin knows, we spend time interacting with our sisters and brothers in the Black Beret organization. Many of those people are still doing something today, whether they're working in labor, whether they're working in community, whatever they may do, but they're still doing that. So let's not let those issues, at the same time, let's understand what the brother just said about John. We need to get down there and support that. We need to make sure that we understand the interconnectedness about what we're talking about here. Because as long as they can attempt to keep us not thinking about the interconnectedness, then that's the longer that they can continue to put the kind of control mechanisms over us that has been. And I just say this lastly, when we were considered in the 60s and 70s as being, you know, a bunch of crazies, we didn't know what we were talking about, we were imagining things and that kind of thing. We talked about the militarization of those checkpoints that were coming in from Las Cruces, you know, and so on. When they used to own the apple, used to ask you, for those that know, it was a fruit checkpoint, no? They check and see if you brought any oranges or apples or whatever. And we said those could get militarized one day. And so those that said, you know, you guys in the left, I consider myself a leftist and I'm proud of it. And based upon that, because I just think a little bit to the left and not to the right. It's not any big complicated situation for me, but they militarized those borders and they did it very clearly. The other thing is we should be talking about residents and not citizens. I want to say that to you, because there's a whole lot of sisters and brothers that are out there working every day for us that don't have papers in this city. So when we're talking about citizens, we need to remember that it's residents we're talking about, because we should be talking about all people, whether it's with papers, without papers, or whatever it is. Because when our people are doing those very dangerous jobs that nobody else wants to do, it don't matter to them, matter of fact, at that point, whether they got papers or whether they don't have papers. And so we know that at that point. So, you know, I just say, and I'm going to have to rush out of here too, you know, but I commend you all. I commend the families. I commend our sisters and brothers on this panel. And just putting a call out, not to preach to the choir, whatever it may be, you know, let's build the kind of movement that really can change and change and build the kind of structural change that's necessary to take some of these issues down. And I'm going to hold, as we continue to do it, whether it's a city council, county commission, whoever it may be, other elected officials, I'm going to call them for what it is, because I'm not going to forget when those families were appealing to those elected officials at that city council meeting, and that they chose to side with the mayor of this city. And I say that, and I know I'm repeating myself. They need to be held responsible. When we talk about wanted signs, we need to see their faces on wanted signs and so on, because that's crimes against the people that they've committed, and we never need to forget that. So I thank you on behalf of our organization so for being here this evening.
Thank you so much for your words, Richard. I'm gonna let the lady here ask one question, and then we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys for your patience. I know it's getting hot in here.
Just a few things that might have been just overlooked. The one more important is the Mary Hahn execution. Forgive me for being blunt, but I've learned as an activist that you have to call it like it is. A lot of the women from the west side, the mothers, have come to me and told me the last time they've ever seen their friend or their children was when the police picked them up to take them to jail. Not so. The next time they heard where they were decapitated and buried in a shallow grave on the west side. These are things that horrified me when I didn't know anything about it. And you know what? I was perfectly fine being blissful and ignorant. But now I'm even better being knowledgeable. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so powerful to see the families who are engaged and are willing to come out in the face of repression and oppression and all the things that could happen to them. I knew Joaquin and Richard didn't get into it, but there's stories about cars being set on fire and walking into the office and all the paintings were turned upside down just so that you would know that someone had been there. So I really want to thank again the panelists. We do have another set of gifts for you guys. You guys are all going to get chile and atole from one of the farms.
Except Joaquin, sorry.
So except for Joaquin, because he's the one who hooked it up. So thank you guys so much for your time. And I would also like to just end on just real quickly on some next steps. I know that there's the DOJ has community hearings coming up next week, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th in different parts of the city. And so there's information being circulated online. If you signed up with us, we'll make sure that you get the email updates about those events. And there's other places for folks to engage. I'll leave it on one note by a famous, very, very famous labor organizer who said on his deathbed, "Don't mourn, organize." Thank you guys.